didn't I? I did. Oh, well. Tonight on Provoked, I hit the button early. But anyway, me and Darryl, we're going to talk Christmas stuff.
All humans break. The difference between humans and gods is that gods can break humans.
Negotiate now. End this war.
You're watching Provoked with Darryl Cooper and Scott Horton, debunking the propaganda lies of the past, present, and future. This is Provoked.
Right, sure as hell is Provoked. I'm Scott Horton, and he's Darryl Cooper. How you doing there? Merry Christmas.
Doing all right. Hi, Scott. Hello, everybody.
Yeah,
Merry
man,
Christmas.
Merry Christmas to everybody, dude. I hope y'all had a good one. I sure as hell did. I spent today driving up and down the river and back, which was not too bad. And I'll tell you what, Chris Williams, if you're listening, we're going to do a big test of your Podsworth app because I could not get my good mic to talk to my phone because they're enemies. It's the Safari. Well, according to ChatGPT, it's the Safari browser thing has a conflict with my stupid Shure mic. So I just had to use my regular ear pods. And so if the audio of my Trita Parsi interview that I recorded out today on the boat comes out sounding great, well, then we'll know that it's Podsworth Media and the Podsworth Media app that gets all the credit for that. But we'll have to wait. But I interviewed Trita today, co-founder of the Quincy Institute, all about America's horrible Iran policy and whether we're going back to war this spring and that kind of thing. So you guys will have to sign up for the Scott Horton. I never could pronounce my own last name right. The Scott Horton Show over at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk about the Christmas truce. What the hell is the Christmas truce, Darryl Cooper?
Well, the Christmas truce, or the Christmas peace, as it's sometimes known, refers to an event that took place on the Western Front of World War I, about 5 months into the First World War, on Christmas. You know, the war started in early August, and by the time you get to Christmas, which is the time that those men, no matter which country they were fighting for, had been told by their leaders, that they'd been told that they'd be home by Christmas, that the war would be wrapped up one way or another by then. And by the time Christmas came, again, you're 5 months into a war that had killed and wounded about 1 million people already, in the first few months. And so, I like to put the entire event into a larger context, of thinking about how, if you go back to, let's say, May of 1914, a month before the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated and the war starts, or begins to pick up, I guess. People are just living in peace in Europe. And there had been no major war on the scale that, we've come to think of as major in 100 years. They had the Crimean War, which was sort of a hinterland war between Britain and France against the Russian Empire and defensive. It was an imperial war, but it was kind of far away, and there were a lot of casualties, and it was a difficult war, but it was experienced as kind of something, almost a colonial war. You had the Franco-Prussian War, which was fairly sharp and bloody, but it was something that was much more traditional in terms of the progress of the thing, where the main army of the French gets surrounded and cut off, and the war's over. That's it. That's the war. And so this is this is what people had experienced. The biggest, longest, bloodiest war anybody knew of in the last 100 years was the American Civil War, which killed maybe 650, 700,000 people in 4 years. And so now we're in World War I. Just a few months before, the continent had been at peace. People had been at their jobs. All of the guys who were out there dying, who were out there in these flooded makeshift trenches that, the December 1914, these are not the trenches of All Quiet on the Western Front or that movie 1917, where they have all the wooden infrastructure built in. And it's almost like, these places have their own zip codes. They're like built into the landscape so firmly. That's not what this was. This is a few months in. So people are adapting on the fly. They just dug these holes and they're just sitting in these muddy, flooded holes, hoping not to get killed, freezing their nuts off. And this was something that came as just an unbelievable shock to, everybody involved. I mean, again, I've mentioned this before when we've talked about my last episode of Enemy, but it's really important to like think about the fact that like the army back then was not something that some people volunteered, but by and large, this wasn't even like Vietnam where you might get drafted. If you're a working class guy, like you got a good chance of getting drafted. Something like that. It was like if you can walk and you don't have some blindness or hearing problem or heart problem that precludes you, you're going to war. Period. If you're within the age and you're healthy enough to do it, and not in some critical industry. And so you went from an entire continent at peace to an entire generation of men across the continent being thrown into this meat grinder that is just chewing them up at a rate that nobody had really ever even conceived of as something that was possible before, right? And so this is the state that this is the place these men are in as you get to that first Christmas. And now there's a lot of anecdote, a lot of probably apocryphal stuff surrounding what happened that day. It was something where, just for everybody who's never heard of it before, basically what happened was up and down the lines on the Western Front, from northern Switzerland to the English Channel at different places, and in some places for long, long stretches of the line, you had people on the German side, soldiers on the German side, and soldiers on the British and French side coming up, mostly British, not as much the French, but mostly British, but coming up out of their trenches and celebrating Christmas together. And this was not something that the rulers kind of came together and said, hey, wouldn't it be nice, for our guys if we just took the day off or something?
Right.
That the officers and the NCOs of the various armies were threatening to shoot people for. And these guys still came up out of their trenches. And the way you have there are certain stories of how some of these incidents started where the British would be over on the other side there, sharing like the kings of all the major countries. They sent their troops care packages, and so they have extra cigarettes and wine and things like that, and they're kind of having a day. And they hear over on the other side, they start hearing a song that they all know, but it's being sung in a different language, Silent Night. And you got to remember, sometimes these trenches were like 40, 50 feet away from each other. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were 500, 1,000 yards. In a lot of places, they were like 40 yards, like very close. And so they've been shouting at each other for weeks, for months. They've been in their trenches, hey, Jerry, hey, Kraut, like just yelling at each other back and forth, taunting each other, talking to each other. And now all of a sudden, those same people, they start to see on the German side, they start to put up, little makeshift Christmas trees, or some of them are even putting their rifles and sticking their bayonets and putting some candles on them and things like that just to light them up. And then they start hearing Silent Night being sung. And there's this really touching story, again, maybe apocryphal. I think it actually made it into that French movie that's about the Christmas truce. But whether it's apocryphal or not, it's worth remembering is real. Sometimes that's the case, I think, is the Germans were singing Silent Night, and they were across no man's land from a group of Scottish soldiers in the British Army who started playing their bagpipes to accompany them. And that was sort of the trigger that sort of got these guys to poke their head up above the trench, which was a death sentence for the last several months, and not get shot, and then actually venture on up. I'd love to know the first brave guy that decided, I'll be the one to take the beach here and like pop my head up and try to start this thing. But then it started spreading, up and down the line. You've got all these stories of them meeting in no man's land, exchanging gifts, playing soccer with each other, singing with each other, playing, they had musical instruments. Some of them had brought along that they were playing together in like mixed bands and stuff. The whole time, the officers and the NCOs are going insane, say it's like that we got to figure out some way to stop this unbelievably beautiful like act of humanity that's taking place here, And yeah, and so that's what the Christmas truce is. It lasted for just that. Well, actually, supposedly in a few places it lasted for a couple days. And so yeah, it's remembered. And if you watch that French movie I talked about, it is remembered sort of in pop culture as like this, as like a symbol of humanity persisting even in the darkest of circumstances. And
Yeah.
like that, yeah, there's definitely some of that. There's like a certain beauty to that part of it. But I think we have to really keep in mind like what the circumstances were here, that this is an entire generation of young men who were thrown to their deaths and to their destruction by corrupt, decadent leaders in Europe. The ruling classes of Europe were really not worthy of their crowns or their positions any longer, and hadn't been for a long time. And they threw these men into this situation thoughtlessly. And as beautiful as it might have been that night, it didn't end the war.
Yeah.
And a lot of these guys, by the way, this is something a lot of people don't know about the Christmas truce. A lot of people who were part of it, they had an idea that maybe it kind of would. Not that like it was going to be this weird, like, spontaneous, just, kind of embracing of the enemy and now the war's over, but that, all of their leaders had told them, you guys will be home by Christmas. Everybody had promised their soldiers that. And now it's Christmas and there's 1 million people dead or wounded. And a decisive victory looks further away than it did, when the war first started. But, decisive victory, that's not really something that, European wars hadn't been fought to annihilation in a really, really long time, like centuries. They had been limited wars that ended with negotiated surrenders by one side or another in dignified ways. And so these guys had some reason to hope that, yeah, they said we'd be done by Christmas, and they meant that there'd be a decisive victory by then. That's not going to happen, but we can still end this thing by Christmas. Like, what is this whole thing really over? Like, what are the stakes really that we're playing for here? So work it out, sit down. Like, and if we come out of our trenches and they see like up and down the lines, people from both sides, guys from both sides are celebrating Christmas together, it'd be like a reminder of our common European humanity, our common Christian humanity. And that maybe, that would sort of provide an impetus to the ruling classes to get themselves together and try to find a way out of this mess. Unfortunately, it didn't do that. And for the rest of the war, Christmas would come and go without anything like this because, the officers and the NCOs were on watch on both sides, making sure that it didn't.
Yeah. Paths of glory, and shoot you right in the head for trying to quit. So yeah, and I guess there was no Christmas truce of 1915, 16. And then I guess the war finally ended right before Christmas in 1917. But I guess I didn't realize, I knew it was that bad, but I really owe it to at least me, if not other people, to go back and really do a lot of rereading about World War I and World War II and how they all played out. I'm not surprised necessarily, but I didn't know that 1 million people had been killed in the first 4 months. And that's just
killed and wounded. It was probably about 5.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry, you did say casualties. Yeah. And that's on both fronts, but that's essentially the machine guns, the Gatling guns and so forth have been invented in time for the Civil War, but sort of just barely. Now this is full automatic machine guns, everywhere, which not like automatic rifles, but still whatever placed guns, and just tearing guys to shreds, where you have guys dying, 10s, 20, 30,000 people dying in a day in these massive wars. And,
in that early part of the war, the Battle of the Frontiers, there was a day in September, I believe it was late August, early September, the French lost 27,000 killed in one day. And it's like when you go back to the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War, the ones that we name ships after later on,
Yeah.
I mean, they're pale in comparison to that. And that turned out to be nothing. That turned out to be just one of many, 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 many of the worst days that these countries would suffer over the course of this just unbelievably pointless war, that really, it's one of those things where like you can look back at World War I. It's kind of similar to like when I think about the leaders in the United States during the World Wars, whether Woodrow Wilson, FDR. You look at Woodrow Wilson. I know we got the course, that CJ did, worst person in the history of, and like you can make that case absolutely based on, you know, the case that he makes. It's very compelling, but I do wonder sometimes if, like, you know, the world was just changing, and if it wasn't him, it would be another guy. Like this was going,
Oh yeah,
this was the way things were headed, you know?
Yeah, Wilson was the Obama of that era compared to TR, who was the W. Bush, you know, or whatever, who was demanding that America get into the war earlier. And so Wilson held out for a while before betraying everyone that he promised and getting us into the war anyway.
You know, I will say, bring up Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, there is one thing to be said for the wars back then, in this war in particular. You know, yeah, you could say they're the Obama, they're, you know, the TR's the George W. Bush or whatever. TR's son was killed over there, you know, and you look across Europe, the sons of these ruling houses across Europe were slaughtered in those trenches, you know.
Yeah.
Like they put their money where their mouths were, at least, you know, even if their mouths were in a really stupid place.
Come on, Darryl. Everybody knows that at least George Bush made his daughters join the army and become nurses and serve in Kuwait and Germany, where they took care of the dead and wounded, you know. Oh, wait, no, that did not happen at all. Sorry. I was just being funny. Hey, not that funny. Listen, I have on the screen here The Christmas Truce of World War I by the great and late William Norman Grigg, my great friend and co-founder with me and Sheldon Richmond of the Libertarian Institute. And we have his full archive of everything he wrote for anyone other than, there's some old John Birch stuff that's lost, although we were able to save some of the stuff that he had done at the New American. But in fact, I know a guy who's got all that stuff digitized. I guess we could figure it out. Anyway, but we have everything else that he ever did and all of his audio and everything. You can find the Will Grigg archive at the Institute there. But anyway, this is his great piece on World War I. And then I wanted to show you this. We do this every year at antiwar.com. We being Mr. Eric Garris here. Here's antiwar.com in dark reader mode. And you can see our picture story is World War I's Christmas truce when fighting paused for the holiday. And then we have a whole section here below the picture story of a whole series of great articles all about it. And here he's got forgotten Paul McCartney music video from 39 years ago reminds us of the Christmas truce. How do you like that? We're not going to play that and get the copyright strike, but everyone can find that. A letter from a British soldier on the Christmas truce of World War I, and then voices of the First World War, their Christmas truce. This is all quotes. I read up on a bunch of this stuff. And by the way, you know, if you do antiwar.com past, like if you just, you know, put in any old date and then look at the URL here, you can change that date to whatever you want over the last 30 years. So look at Christmas for years past, and you'll see different collections of articles about the Christmas truce there. We got lots of great stuff for you. And then including this 2021 article by David Stockman, who you guys might know as a brilliant genius, the former budget director for Ronald Reagan before he resigned in disgust. But he's good on a lot of things. So in case y'all are interested in that, more readings on the Christmas truce there. And yeah, you know, I really am. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, like, one of the things that I was really trying to get across in the series I did on the American labor movement, a couple episodes of which are still to come after I'm done with World War II. But one of the things I was trying to get across is knowing I have, like, not exclusively by any means, but, you know, a large audience of conservative and right-wing people who kind of been trained by the 20th century, when this is a perfectly appropriate attitude to have, to not like organized labor, you know, which again in 2025 is a totally understandable position to take. But to show them that, like, you know, these things weren't always like this. You know, there was a time where, like, these were just guys who were swinging wrenches in the daytime and trying not to get shot by Pinkertons at night while they were, you know, like that things were different. There's people in our past, in our history, that you probably are, you know, inclined to kind of just pass over, you know, with, you know, just sort of to ignore them, or even to think of them with just sort of some reflexive contempt because of what you associate with them, that honestly should be some of our heroes, people like Mother Jones, you know. And this is one of the things that you read about in all of these stories of the Christmas truce is up and down the line. And again, most of these were French and British soldiers, so it kind of really does show you the internationalist element of it. Is a lot of them started singing the Marseillaise, the French revolutionary song. Kind of became like the official or unofficial, rather, national anthem of like the Red Revolution, the workers' revolution across Europe. And they were getting together and singing that, and the bands were playing it and everything. And it was the song of the international socialist movement, basically. And we think about that today, especially again on the right, and we say, oh, just that's maybe this Christmas truce thing wasn't so great after all, or something. The thing I would ask people to like really try to keep in mind is that at the time, as societies across Europe are going through these unbelievably rapid changes, industrialization is driving people out of their traditional lives in the countryside into these overcrowded cities where they're scraping and looking for work, just trying to survive as they're packed into tenement houses, like masses and masses of people. Populations are exploding. There's not enough housing for people. And just the societies are really struggling to cope with all the technological, all of these kind of things that are happening so fast. And you have this new class of people that really didn't exist before, which in Europe at the time meant most people, the working class, and you could include like a lot of what we think of as the middle class as the working class back then. They were like, the point is that they relied on wages, from a job in order to be able to put food in their kids' mouths. They weren't proprietors, they weren't farmers, they weren't capitalists, in the sense of owners of capital or anything like that. And, you had only a few ideologies or movements that were really kind of trying to define like who these people were and what their place in society ought to be. And, eventually, you have nationalism to compete with international socialism. But nationalism was looked at very much at the time still as like a bourgeois movement. This was something that like the middle and upper middle classes, the business classes were really into for reasons that had to do with their class interests.
Oh, we should just specify real quick, Darryl, that you're talking about before the commies took over Moscow. That was in October of 1917. So there is no example of what is the commie red flag USSR.
There's also that. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sorry, go ahead. I just want to put that in time there.
Yeah. Just that, this was a time where you had all of these people who had been isolated in their own countries, kind of as these transitions are taking place, coming into contact with their class counterparts and sometimes their ethnic counterparts on opposite sides of the line. You go over to like go over to the east, and Poland hadn't existed in a couple centuries because it had been partitioned by the Russian Empire, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, just split into three pieces. Each of those three empires got a large population of Poles, Jews in Russia and Austria, Ukrainians, a lot of others, Ruthenians, and so all of these empires, these are multinational, multi-ethnic empires, they conscripted their people into these mass armies. And so you've got like Slavs, Poles, being conscripted into the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires and made to go fight each other, right? And so these kind of things really like forced people, they forced the question of loyalty and forced the question of identity like to the foreground in a way that it really hadn't been for a long time for that class of people. You had all of a sudden, something beyond just class unity across borders that people were thinking about as like, what it is that we should identify and define ourselves by. And it led later to a lot of the, if you think about it now, like this, today we think of like the Zionists as one of these like few nationalist movements, nationalist groups that like they really don't think of themselves as having like national boundaries. They don't think of themselves as having even like citizenship, like being a citizen of Israel is not really what makes you a member of their society. You could be a Jew in Brooklyn and you're part of the crew because it's sort of a Volkish movement in that old German sense. And back then, you had Germans living in the Baltic states, you had Germans living in Poland, you had Germans living in Russia, throughout Russia, over by the Volga region. And there was a kind of a question of like, well, these are Russian Germans. Yeah, they're ethnic Germans, but are they like a Mexican American? That's not a Mexican. Here in America, we'll get a guy named Eisenhower and have him lead our army to go conquer Germany. You know what I mean? Like, whereas back then, like these questions were kind of open. Like, are these people Russian? Are they Germans because they're German ethnically? Same with the Poles and all these groups. It just forced all these questions kind of to the foreground in a way that people had not been thinking about them as much before. And after the war, as all these empires started to fall apart, huge amount of the violence and chaos that ensued in Central and Eastern Europe was really like these questions that had arisen as a result of this being hashed out like in real time.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so ignorant about this stuff, but I read the great book Wilson's War by James Powell, where he talks about really the aftermath of the war and how Woodrow Wilson's intervention is really what allowed for Lenin and Trotsky to seize power in Russia by prolonging the war, by bribing Kerensky to stay in the war after the original revolution in March of 17. And then, of course, how the reparations and the stripping of all the territories and the humiliation of Germany with the war reparations and everything had helped lead to the rise of the Nazi Party. And, of course, they smashed the Ottoman Empire, which turned the Middle East over to the British and the French. And so then from there goes World War II and world communism and the American world empire and Zionism and all of the rest of so much of the problems. But so it's a really great read. For that reason, I highly recommend
it. Conflict that really, even though we don't think of it this way, we think of World War I as being a much cleaner war than World War II because it was. There wasn't as much just targeted massacre of civilians, things like that. That's definitely true. But it did like.
What were the total numbers killed? What were the total numbers killed and wounded? Do you know?
Killed and wounded total, like about 40 million. That's if you're counting civilians as well, and I think that counts the Spanish flu. But about 20 million like battle casualties.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then the Russian Empire, or the Russian Civil War afterward, you're talking another 6 to 10 million killed.
And the initial communism before Lenin tried to do the new economic policy, and then the secondary communism when Stalin came and did the Holodomor and all of that.
Yeah, and so one of the things we think of the First World War as like a much cleaner war because it was, but it really did go a long way toward normalizing things that would really come to full fruition in the Second World War, and not just the Armenian genocide and what was going on down there. Just after the war, for example, all of these countries that had previously been part of the German Reich that got split off by the Treaty of Versailles, you end up with millions of Germans in countries now that are varying degrees of hostile to them, either because everybody knows, like, if you're living in East Prussia, which is now Poland, and you're a German, which is almost everybody who lived there, they all know, everybody who runs that government, all the Poles there who were very defensive of their new nationalist project, obviously, they know you don't want to be part of Poland. They know you want to be part of Germany again. So you have this large group of people over here that the national government does not trust. And you have like varying degrees of persecution of all these different groups, and not just against the Germans, Poles and Ukrainians, Russians and Ukrainians, Russians and Poles, like all these different groups that are moving out in the chaos immediately after the war, before the Treaty of Versailles has been hammered out. And everybody kind of knows what, the major allies are going to apportion to them as their new countries. They're trying to create realities on the ground, go militarily conquer this place. And then, the people in Versailles are eventually going to have to look at this and just be like, what are we going to go kick them out? No. Okay. It's yours, just establish the reality on the ground. And so this was happening. You got massacres, pogroms going on all across Eastern Europe during this period. The Poles and the Ukrainians going after each other was probably the nastiest particular one. The Poles and the Russians, the Red Army fight, as the Poles had to retreat out of Belarus and back into Poland, they were murdering and burning villages as they went back. And then the Russians did the same, or the Soviets did the same thing as they came into Poland. Really, really ugly stuff. And the thing that carried over into the post-war period and over into the Second World War was this idea that, again, it's kind of hard for us to really put our minds in this space today because it's just very foreign to us. But you had like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which just like spoke a couple dozen languages. In their parliament, they spoke a bunch of languages. These were really complex, like multi-ethnic creations. And if you were like loyal to the emperor, you might be. There was like budding ethno-nationalism that was starting to crop up. I mean, that's a big part of like what caused the dissolution of these empires during the war. But still, there were a lot of people of all ethnicities who thought, actually the Austro-Hungarian Empire is a pretty solid thing to be a part of. It wasn't like everybody wanted their own little statelet, and wanted independence from this. And as time went on, like you get toward the end of the war, or after, especially in the months and maybe 2-3 years after the First World War, as you got all of these populations that are being ethnically cleansed from these territories, Poles kicking out the Germans, Russians kicking out the Germans, or them fleeing because they're being persecuted and their properties being seized. And this being looked at kind of like as, even by the Allies, is like not even really something that's that unfortunate. The British encouraged the Greeks to go attack the new state of Turkey after the war in a totally separate war. And the Greeks went into Turkey. It was very ugly. There were a lot of atrocities carried out against the Muslim populations, things like that. And then as the Turks pushed them back into Greece, huge amounts of atrocities like against the Christian populations in what was Turkey at the time and in Greece when they pushed them back. And then afterwards, the settlement that they came up with, and this was totally endorsed by all the Allies, is, hundreds of thousands, I think a million Turks or Greeks in Turkey got forcibly relocated back to Greece, and a bunch of Muslims got forcibly relocated back to Turkey. Just a huge population exchange. It was not voluntary. And this was something that was just looked at as like, well, yeah, this is like what happens, and it really put this huge emphasis on like your ethnicity, your race in like the old 19th, early 20th century sense of the word, where there's a British race and a German race and things like that. Like your race was really who you are. And that this was something that was recognized by literally everybody, including like the victorious, democratic states. I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people have a lot of trouble with today, is that, Woodrow Wilson's principle of national self-determination. What's he talking about? He's talking about ethno-nationalism. That's what he's talking about,
Well, and the problem here is, as you're describing, is you have these ethnicities who have been all spread around over the millennia, or over the centuries, however far back into antiquity you want to go, which means that then you have to have these massive ethnic cleansing campaigns all over the place, or you have just, in fact, people stuck on the wrong side of the line all over the place, wherever they came in and drew all the new borders. And of course, that was the precipitating cause or event, at least, let's say. We'll go ahead and say Hitler's will was the cause, but the dispute was over the German city of Danzig and whether the German state was going to have access to it, or whether the Poles were going to, let them have that corridor or not. That was the dispute.
Yeah. Well, and the territory that Hitler was like initially interested in when they were still in a negotiating phase, trying to get that done. And what he, when he invaded, the way he looked at it, and this is in their discussions, their writings, and again, you can look back and say it's all a cynical sort of self-justification, but I mean, I don't really think so. I think that they're still people, and they think about things the way people do. They looked at it as like this territory that's in dispute here, that you're calling like sacred Polish territory, was literally majority German until like 20 years ago when you drove everybody out. And, the same with like when you look down at like the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, you have 3 million Germans living there as a super majority, had been living there for centuries. Just the stroke of a pen in Versailles cuts that whole section off from Germany and gives it to this new state, this new very weird state of Czechoslovakia, which is in and of itself is like a bi-ethnic state that's dominated by the Czechs. The Slovaks initially didn't even really want to be a part of it. The Czechs invaded Slovakia, and then it's very, very strange, like even to begin with. But then you got these 3 million Germans living up on the border of Germany who are not happy about the fact that they're no longer German citizens, and when the Czech government starts forming up, they look at these people as a potential fifth column, because they probably are. You know what I mean? Like, again, like, and a fifth column is like a little bit different when you're talking about, like, say, like maybe a group of immigrants that comes into the country and they're traitors for the old country or something. But like a fifth column is a little bit different when, like, 3 months ago they used to be part of that country and you just redrew the line. It's a little bit different,
Yeah.
And so they saw them that way. They didn't trust them. When the German population there, they weren't armed, they weren't organized for any kind of military conflict after the war. So they just came out into the streets and protested. And the Czechs sent the army up there, a huge, like the core of which was built out of the Czech Legion, which had been over in the Russian Civil War, just fighting an insanely brutal war over there, where they had taken over half of Siberia and kind of fought their way back to Europe. Very hardcore people who were just over there fighting the Russian Civil War the way the Russian Civil War was being fought by everybody else. Very brutal. And they sent the army up there and massacred, unarmed German protesters by the hundreds sometimes. And so these are the territories that when you get up to 1939 and Hitler's like saying, we want this back, we want this back, we want this back. These are all things that like were so fresh in people's memory, and after the First World War, when all of these things are taking place, there are literally just camps across Germany, refugee camps for, well over 1 million Germans that were flooding back in from Russia, from Poland, from all these other countries that were coming in, who had had all their property taken from them and just thrown out, a lot of them showing up with nothing. And they're just there for months and months at a time, sometimes in refugee camps scattered all across Germany. And the German public is calling on the new government, the new Weimar government that's formed up, that like, look what's happening to the Germans in Poland. You got to do something about this. And the Weimar government, they couldn't do anything about it. They're in no position to. They didn't have the resources. They couldn't do anything about it. But it really hurt the legitimacy of that government, like at an early stage in its life. And later on, it's one of the reasons why when Hitler started really speaking up for and then acting on behalf of the Germans over the border in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, one of the reasons that it was so popular in Germany, as it was looked at as like as sort of erasing, as redeeming this shameful period after the First World War, when all these things were happening to German people in these other countries and their government couldn't or wouldn't do anything about it. And so a lot of these things, like all of these seeds all the seeds of the Second World War are planted in the First World War and its immediate aftermath.
Yeah. All right. So now I don't know who coined the phrase, Darryl, but I think Pat Buchanan calls the First and Second World War both the Great Civil War of the West, and even really the suicide of Western civilization, even in the first.
I think Ernst Nolte, was the first one to really talk about it in those terms.
Yeah.
And it's the correct way to think about it.
Yeah. And, whatever. It's a metaphor in this kind of thing, but it was like, I think the way Pat put it was, the suicide was in the First World War. The Second World War and everything after that is just the death rows kind of thing. But what was Western civilization died during this thing. And one thing that James Powell talks about also in that book, I think it's just the prologue to James Powell's book. Again, it's called Wilson's War. And Woodrow Wilson's great blunder created Hitler, Lenin, or whatever, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, World War II, something like that. Anyway, he talks about in the beginning how it was two giant trade blocks. They had free trade blocks, but they were separate from each other. And those were the blocks that became the Allied and Axis powers. So it was very much like a dispute over, access to coal resources on the other side of the line and that kind of thing, where if they had all joined their two separate trade pacts into one big free trade pact, then war probably could have been avoided. But a huge part of the motive for the war was seizing each other's resources that they couldn't just get on the market, but these guys have coal and these guys have steel or, iron and whatever it is that they needed. So, to show that, I guess, because of these intercontinental, more or less at least, free trade pacts, both sides were able to build up these giant militaries to fight each other with, right? They were able to afford it, to militarize to such a degree to hurt each other so bad. And then back to the story of the Christmas truce, where the point is that They're singing the same song in a different dialect, man, right? Like these are people who actually are the same. Their leaders are essentially in a conspiracy with each other to force these people to fight each other in the name of protecting themselves, which is, the same thing you're talking about here, right? This is the whole point of the state. It claims to be a security force. It claims to be the protector of its people. That's what Putin is doing in far eastern Ukraine right now. He's claiming to be the protector of ethnic Russian people because he's the Muscovite state over there. And that's the way, that's his so-called mandate of heaven or whatever, to his holy writ, to protect them. Just the same as, and I have this quote in my book where Solzhenitsyn, the famous Soviet dissident, says, well, how would America feel if America's empire fell and you lost everything west of the Mississippi River and Mexico retook Texas and the Southwest, but then they outlawed the Protestant religions and they started persecuting the Anglos? Then what do you think that the U.S. government would do? Nothing. And presumably you would still have an Anglo-led government in Washington, is what he's saying there, that they might tolerate the loss of Texas for a time. But if the Mexican government that retakes Texas starts really persecuting Protestant Anglos, well, they're going to claim to be our security force and come back down over here. I forgot if his analogy went that far. Maybe it was just, how would you feel if you lost the Southwest in this way? And no, I think he does talk about, and the Protestants were persecuted and all that. Anyway, people can find the quote in the book, but
when people think about like what the communist revolutions that kicked off afterwards, one of the things to keep in mind, it's really important. First of all, you made a very important point, is to remember that every person who is called a communist or a socialist or an anarchist or whatever, all these, scare words, before 1917, they'd never seen it in practice. Okay. So these people weren't watching the Holodomor and then, covering it up in the New York Times or something. They'd never seen it. It was all in their heads. And this was, I cut those people a little bit of slack, especially for this reason. And this is really important to remember. At the time, nobody else except for the socialists were really explaining to them what you were just saying, why these ruling classes are sending all of you millions to go die for something that, again, you have the same religion, you sing the same songs in different dialects on the same holidays.
Hey, the kings are all cousins.
The kings are all cousins. And then, doing it, like, people are gradually finding out, like, because they want the coal resources in the Ruhr region or something like that. And so, who's explaining this to the average worker, the average guy in the trench? The fact is, back then, it was really only the socialists. They were the only ones with like a story to tell. And when the fascists, whether, real fascists like Mussolini or just, like the National Socialists like Hitler, all these groups came out, that was like, one of the things I think a misconception a lot of people have is that, like, they think of as fascist and National Socialist types as if these were like traditionalist movements, conservative movements. They were not at all conservative movements. These were modernist revolutionary movements who had very little good to say about the old regimes that were overthrown in World War I. They looked at it the way that the socialists and the communists did. Those are the people that threw us into this, and so we're not going back to that. No, you're not bringing back the Kaiser. You're not bringing back the emperor, anything like that. Hell no. That was not they were not looking backwards in that sense. It was an alternative explanation of who it was that had driven you into those trenches. And, some explanations were truer than others. And some, had more destructive consequences than others, obviously. But it's really important, just like to see the significance of, like, when things like that happen, or in more modern times, when we have this just 25-year run of disasters in the war on terror, or you have something like the financial crisis that just destroys so many lives, to look out there and be like, the average person is not going to go meditate in his room and like come up with his own original explanation for what caused all of this. He's going to look at the available narratives that are being offered to him, and he's going to choose between the one that sounds the most plausible and maybe the one that serves his interests and his preconceptions the most, whatever, but he's going to choose between available narratives. And so the importance of like providing people with explanations in a really compelling way that they can understand, so that when these things happen, they can understand what's happening to them in a way that's not going to lead them down a destructive path, is so important, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what libertarianinstitute.org is about. And speaking of which, here also we got this, just like on my shirt. It's the Scott Horton Academy. This is, oh, I need to take that Provoked thingy down. The Scott Horton Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom is the sponsor of this show. And today, and for the rest of the year at least, if you use the promo code Wormser, or just go to scotthortonacademy.com/Wormser, you'll save 20%. So our Christmas discount is over. This is the day after Christmas here. Our Christmas 20 discount is over. But now David Wormser's all upset because me and Dave Smith did a show attacking him over there on Part of the Problem. And, well, he's the ruiner of all things good. And so we trashed him, and he's upset over there on the Twitter. So Tom Wood says, monetize your enemies. Promo code Wormser for 20% off. And by the way, I just added, finally, the part 1 of the Cold War course, Darryl. So I have my, of course, 30-hour course on the terror wars. But then part 1 of the Cold War course, H.W. Bush through Obama, is also about 30 hours. And in fact, I think the terror wars one is only 25. But Bush Sr. through Obama is 31 hours long, is part 1 of my course on the new Cold War. And I'm getting so much great feedback. People, especially over the holidays, are taking road trips and they're listening to Ramsey Baroud and his great presentation on Israel-Palestine and all these other things. And anyway, I'm really excited about it. Getting lots of great feedback on the Cold War course, as well as the terror war course and all the rest. scotthortonacademy.com/Wormser and save some money there. And then I got to show you this too. Just scan that there QR code, or go to scotthorton.org/coffee, or just click, go to scotthorton.org and click the link there in the right-hand margin of the page there, and it'll take you there. And it's really good stuff, man. I have some right here. This bag only is this thin because I already drank some of this stuff. But this is my prop bag. It tastes just like me, Scott Horton Show brand coffee, and it's very wonderful. And I get little emails all day long from people buying this stuff, and I see the same names over and over and over again, people buying it over and over and over again because of how wonderful it is. And we all got to drink coffee, so you might as well drink coffee that supports the anti-war party over here at the Provoked show. And while I'm at it too, I got to also share with you our great sponsor, Matt Cercily. And he is he runs Agorist Tax Advice. And this is, as it says here, tax planning attorney for small businesses and high income professionals. So if you're trying to do business, you're trying to avoid the tax man. Obviously, the IRS is the greatest enemy of any free person trying to make a living in this world. And so there's no gimmicks here. This is not some trick where you get to file a zero return and not pay your taxes like Peter Schiff's dad or anything. He died in prison, by the way. No, this guy is a lawyer, and his job is making sure that you pay exactly what you owe and not one penny more than that to the scum at the IRS. And so it's the hero, Matt Cercily. I mean, if he's intervening in your life, you're going to consider him that, believe me. Matt Cercily, and he helps support this show because we're anti-war guys, and he's into that. So that's pretty good. And now, so I think we should go ahead and take some questions from the crew before we wrap up the show today. I saw one guy was, I believe, referring to my oversimplification about, did I say Mexico taking back the Southwest? Okay, just taking it. Yes, paper claims it was Indian territory. But anyway.
And by the way,
analogy still stands, god dang it.
You know,
Go ahead.
something I only learned like maybe 2-3 years ago, because it was something that I, like a lot of Americans, I guess, like the Mexican-American War is kind of this background thing in the 19th century. I didn't know Mexico started that war. That kind of changes like the whole argument you hear now about whose land that is and whether it's stolen. Like, come on, man. They started the war. Did you know that?
That Mexico started the war?
Yes.
Well, depending on if you accept the border was the San Jacinto or the Rio Grande. I mean, the border
came with guns, man.
the border of Texas is now the Rio Grande. At that time, the troops were on the Mexican side of the line, deliberately provoking, getting shot at, which was the deal. That's why they called Abraham Lincoln Spotty Lincoln, because Lincoln went up there and gave a speech talking about, now, exactly where were these men standing when they got shot at again? And they went, oh, listen to Abraham Lincoln going on and on about what it matters, which side of the line the soldiers were on when they got shot at. Old Spotty Lincoln. He's such a stickler for details. So yes, it was highly disputed territory. And this is fun actually in Howard Zinn in A People's History is it Zachary Taylor? I think his diaries about, boy, are we doing these people wrong, man, and all that in there. It's been a very long time since I read that. I'm pretty sure that's who it was. Anyway.
Let's do some questions.
This guy, he donates and he says he was at America Fest when Ben Shapiro called out Darryl, but he did not get a chance to ask him about the Iraq war there. Let me talk about the Wormser thing for a second. See, people always blame Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz as well. They should, but see, Wormser, and even to this day, believes, he was really the principal author of the Clean Break and Coping with Crumbling States. I think he's the only author of that. But the Clean Break, it has him and Pearl and Feith on there, but he's really the guy, I believe, and whatever, Pearl agreed with him, but he wrote it. Anyway, their whole idea for the Iraq war was that the Jordanians would be dominant in Iraq and that the Hashemite king would be able to tell the Iraqi Shia what to do, and then they would break from Hezbollah. They would force Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran. They would become allies with Israel and build the oil pipeline to Haifa and become a nightmare for Iran, and inspire revolutionary change against the Ayatollah's regime there. And all this was just an absolute crack pipe dream. And it's funny because the guy still insists that the Shiites have to do whatever the Hashemites say. As Dave Smith said in the show, well, then how come King Abdullah don't just tell them all to knock it off right now? He can just tell, hey, Hezbollah, you guys be nice to Israel. You have to do what I say, David Wormser says. But no, that doesn't work. Anyway. This guy asks a good question to you. Why didn't the Christmas truce reoccur? Or I guess here would be a corollary to that. Did they have any Easter truces or any Halloween truces or any other kind of thing where like the soldiers themselves decided that they wanted to stop fighting and take a little holiday there, get along for a minute? Or this was just it?
Yeah, this was it. The command was very much on guard for it in future years and made sure it didn't happen. And a lot of the people who were sort of the main people who kicked it off at various points and they considered like most likely to maybe do it again, those people got sent to the front at the Somme, at Verdun. They got sent out to the east, so they weren't on the Western Front, things like that. So
yeah. Hey, this guy said he gave Scott Horton flavored coffee to all his, branded whatever coffee to all of his family for Christmas. That was cool of you. I bet they were appreciative of that. Yeah, that movie Paths of Glory with Kirk Douglas. If people haven't seen that, that's a great one, man. Oh, this guy says I look like Santa. Well, I should put on my Santa hat that my auntie made for me. This is I guess it is kind of a Christmassy red, this shirt. So yeah. Yeah, here. I would like to offer you a can of soup. This guy says, I'm not sure I get the reference, although I am kind of hungry. Yeah. Nigeria. Donald Trump is bombing Nigeria, Darryl. And of course, it occurred to me the same as everyone that Bill Maher must be really relieved because we all know that the Christians of Nigeria have been utmost in his thoughts lately. And he has just been beset with concern for their fate. So Donald Trump says it's ISIS targets that he's hitting there in Nigeria. And we've had special operations forces traipsing around Nigeria, especially during late Bush years. I don't really know about Obama times. But now we got drones. We've been bombing Somalia. at a higher rate than any time during previous Trump or Obama or W. Bush, who of course started, but the drone war under him, really cranked up under Obama. But it's been more than 117 times this year in the first year of Trump's second term that America has bombed not just al-Shabaab, but also supposed Islamic State targets there as well. So now they're bombing Nigeria. And it just occurred to me, Darryl, what do you think of my hypothesis that this is just a public relations stunt for the Zionists? This just has Hezbollah, because there's this whole narrative that, oh yeah, well, how come you don't care about this, that, and the other thing, everything in the world except the Gaza Strip? You know what? I heard that there's fighting going on down there in Nigeria somewhere. How come I don't hear you talking about Nigeria all the time? So now they've decided to embellish this issue and make a big thing out of it. Now to the degree that they're actually drone striking people to death over there in the name of this menace that they're really just pretending to care about, because they're trying to change the subject from fundamentalist radical Jewish Zionism to fundamentalist radical bin Ladenite jihadi Islam.
Is this something that's being done at the request of, or at least in cooperation with, the Nigerian government?
I don't know.
Okay. Or is this just something we're saying, get out of the way, we're doing it? Because I mean, those to me are like
the same thing.
Different. No, I don't think so. I don't think they're the same thing. But maybe both not good. But I mean, look, the fact is, like, the idea, I do think it's a publicity stunt. I don't know if it's for that reason, but I think, Trump likes to say things that he knows appeal to a certain part of his base, when he makes noises about the plight of the white South Africans or Christians in various places. And here he's actually doing something about it. But it's, you kind of alluded to it. If we really cared about the persecution and killing of Christians around the world, we'd be bombing Tel Aviv. So,
yeah. Well, and I'm not calling for that, because they got nukes and other reasons too. There's innocent people that live there. But yes, they are the world's worst human rights abusers by far. And I had missed this headline, Darryl, but there was a big story in October where a majority of American Jews, I believe it was 55%. I'm going to shake your ground with this, but I'm pretty sure it was a bare majority of American Jews believed that the Israeli government was guilty of war crimes and was committing war crimes in the war in Gaza. This was in October. So I guess like just on the eve of the alleged ceasefire, the ostensible ceasefire. But, and then 40% of American Jews say that the Israeli government is guilty of committing genocide. And that is in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency and, other major publications from October. And I had missed that, but somebody made reference to it in a video or whatever, and I went back and checked. And I'm solid on the 40%. I'm sorry, I forget now on the bare majority on the war crimes, but whatever. 40% of American Jews. So I don't know exactly what, it's been a while since I read these surveys about what percentage of American Jews call themselves Zionists at all or identify with Israel at all. I know it used to be at least a majority, but it was far from unanimous. I mean, there's like what it was, I believe if you go back 10 years or something, it's like a third of American Jews said that they didn't identify with Israel at all. It's just another country in the world somewhere. What do they care? They're Americans. They're from wherever they're from. You know what I mean? Whatever city they're from is where they're from, like any other American.
Yeah, I mean, that attitude right there is something that the Zionist propaganda machine has been waging war against for a long time. I saw a poll just today, actually, which I assume it was from recently. I don't remember the date, but it was British Jews being polled, and it was something crazy, like 87% said that they considered anti-Zionism to be anti-Semitism. And that whole idea, because like the reverse version of that, like another way to say it from the opposite direction, is that the actions of the state of Israel are the collective responsibility of all Jews around the world. And so if you dislike one, you dislike the other. Like that's kind of what they're saying, is they're associating those two things. And, it's, I imagine that number probably fluctuates. If you were to poll American Jews, how much do you identify with the state of Israel on October 8th, 2023? Probably get a higher number than you'd get now, or that you would have gotten 10 years ago. So circumstances play a role, but I mean, that idea, the thing that Israel represents all Jews around the world, that on some level, like, the things that it does are on behalf of the Jews of the world, that's a very dangerous proposition for the Jews who do live around the world. You saw it in Australia. It's that idea that, those jihadists in Australia who shot all those people at Bondi Beach, they were kind of just taking the Israeli government at its word, that they represent all Jews around the world. If Jews are in Australia, they're part of the war in Gaza, just like, if they're in Tel Aviv, and they're just sort of accepting the premise that the Israeli government puts out. And, it's one that you'd like to see rejected, but, it's a tough thing. The world order is realigning in unpredictable ways right now as the nation state starts to, waver a little bit, and people are kind of trying to find new ways to self-identify, as groups. And so, it's hard to say how it's going to shake out.
Yeah, and man, I'm worried about the next economic crash. I was just looking at some numbers where the price to earning ratios and all this, and Warren Buffett is putting some huge percentage of his money in cash right now because he's waiting for everything to completely crash so he can buy it at rock bottom prices and this kind of thing. I mean, because it's inflationary times. So if you're putting all your money in cash, you're worried about something.
Dude, have you seen, isn't silver's at like $75 or something?
Yeah.
That's crazy. I remember back in like my econ nerd days in the 2000s when I was reading just like these crappy blog, like nerdy econ nerd blogspot blogs, like, in 2004, 2005, predicting the housing crisis and everything, and waiting for that to happen. All these like silver bugs, gold bugs. And as it got up, I think the high back then was like $51 or something. And nobody could believe it. Those are like 1982 numbers. It's crazy, or whatever year it was in that Volcker time. And now it's up to 75. It's wild.
Yeah. And congratulations to all the gold bugs and silver bugs who've been saving this whole time. It's paid off. But yeah, and then when the next crash comes, I don't know, it might just be 2008 again, where it sucks for a lot of people, but overall, fundamentally, it's rinse and repeat, or it could be much worse than that. I mean, a lot of people are already feeling on edge, and right now is the supposed good times before the big correction comes. So I guess maybe that'll be a topic for another night. But I should let you go, and I should let these people go, Darryl. We should. It's Christmas time, and people are away from their family because we're so good, but we should let them go back to their family. I should let you go back to yours as well. And so have a Merry Christmas. Thanks for doing the show with me. It's been a great year, and I think we still got one more of these Fridays left in the year. So
January 2nd, I believe.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay. What do I got here? Oh, you're right. What do I know about things? So this is our last show for the year.
Yeah.
So
see you in 2026.
Absolutely, man. Thank you, Darryl. And thank you, everybody. And now I just got to click the thing. Good night, y'all.
This has been Provoked with Darryl Cooper and Scott Horton. Be sure to like and subscribe to help us beat the propaganda algorithm. Go follow at Provoked_show on X and YouTube. And tune in next time for more Provoked.